Picture this. A scientist sits across from a chimpanzee named Washoe. No bars between them, no lab coat, no clipboard. Just two beings face to face. The scientist raises his hand and forms a shape. Washoe watches him, tilts her head, and raises her own hand in response. She just said, hello. That happened in 1966, and scientists have spent the 50 years since trying to figure out what it actually means. Can we talk to animals? Not train them to do tricks. Not read their body language like amateur detectives. Actually talk to them the way you and I are communicating right now. Because the answer is stranger and more complicated than anything you'd expect. Some researchers say we're already doing it. Others say we've been fooling ourselves the entire time. And a handful of experiments buried in academic journals and mostly ignored by the public suggest the truth is something else entirely. Here is what we actually know. Let's start with what language even is, because this is where most of the confusion lives. When people ask whether animals can talk, they usually picture a parrot saying words or a dog following commands. That's not language. That's mimicry and conditioning. Real language, according to linguists, requires something called combinatorial productivity. That means you take a limited set of symbols and combine them in new ways to generate an unlimited number of meanings. You have never heard the exact sentence I'm saying to you right now, but you understood it instantly. That's the miracle of language. The question is whether any animal besides humans can do that. The short answer, based on everything we know, is that no animal in the wild uses language the way we do. But the long answer is what makes this topic worth an entire video. Dolphins have something researchers call a signature whistle. Every dolphin develops its own unique sound in infancy, and other dolphins use that exact sound to address them specifically. When scientists played signature whistles back to dolphins, the animals responded, turned toward the speaker, and whistled back. That is not just communication. That is something that looks a lot like names. Dolphins call each other by name. They have been observed borrowing each other's signature whistles when they want to get someone's attention, which is about as close to shouting across a room as a dolphin can get. Elephants communicate across distances so vast that humans cannot hear them at all. They produce infrasound, vibrations below the threshold of human hearing, and transmit these signals through the ground itself. Other elephants pick up these ground vibrations through their feet and their trunks. When researchers played recordings of deceased matriarchs to their former herds, the elephants froze and gathered together, visibly unsettled. They recognized the voice of a dead family member. They have social memories encoded in sound that outlast the individual who made them. Prairie dogs, which most people would not immediately associate with sophisticated communication, turn out to have one of the most detailed alarm call systems ever documented. Researcher Kon Slobodikov spent decades analyzing their calls and discovered that prairie dogs do not just warn each other that a predator is coming. They describe the predator. Different calls for hawks versus coyotes versus humans. But it goes further than that. Their calls encode the size of the approaching human, the color of their clothing, and how fast they are moving. They have a word for something they have never encountered in their evolutionary history. When Slobodikov wore different colored shirts and walked through a prairie dog colony on different days, the calls changed based on the shirt color. The prairie dogs were generating new descriptions of new things, which is exactly the kind of flexible meaning-making that linguists associate with language. Now, here's where things get more complicated. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was an explosion of research into teaching primates sign language or symbolic systems. Washoe, the chimpanzee from the opening of this video, learned hundreds of signs and used them in combinations. A gorilla named Coco became famous for her emotional vocabulary. A bonobo named Kanzi learned to communicate using a keyboard of symbols called lexigrams. And what Kanzi could do genuinely shocked researchers. He did not need to be explicitly trained on each symbol. He learned by watching his mother being trained, which is observational learning, and he understood spoken English sentences he had never heard before, responding appropriately to novel requests. He was not pattern matching, he was processing meaning. But then a researcher named Herb Terrace raised a chimpanzee named Nim Chimpsky, a deliberate reference to the linguist Noam Chomsky, with the specific goal of teaching him language. And Terrace's conclusion after years of work was devastating to the field. He argued that Nim and other signing apes were not using language. They were doing something much simpler, learning that certain gestures produced rewards and stringing them together randomly to maximize the chance of getting something they wanted. What looked like sentences was actually sophisticated begging. Terrace's paper landed like a grenade. Funding dried up. The field retreated. Decades later, researchers went back to the videotapes of Nim and found something interesting. Terrace's trainers had been heavily prompting Nim before he signed, essentially feeding him the answers. The study had a serious methodological problem. It was not that Nim was incapable. It was that the experiment had not given him the room to demonstrate capability. Kanzi's work, conducted under much more rigorous conditions by Sue Savage Rumbaugh, never had those problems, and Kanzi kept doing things that simple conditioning could not explain. He commented on things that were not immediately relevant to getting food or attention. He made jokes. He used symbols to refer to things that were not present. These are behaviors that define reference and displacement, two of the core features of genuine language. Here is what all of this suggests, and it is something that linguists are still arguing about today. Language is not a light switch. It is not something you either have or you do not. It is a continuum, a spectrum of abilities that evolved in pieces over millions of years, and different species ended up with different pieces of it. Dolphins have something like proper nouns. Prairie dogs have something like adjectives. Elephants have something like emotional memory embedded in sound. Bonobos have something like reference and displacement. What humans have is all of it, assembled into the most complex communication system on the planet. But the components were not invented from scratch. They were inherited, modified, and recombined from ancestors we share with every other animal on this list. This reframes the original question completely. Instead of asking whether we can talk to animals, the better question is, are we already sharing pieces of language with species that develop those pieces independently? And if so, what would it take to actually bridge the gap? Some researchers think technology is the answer. A project called Earth Species Project is using machine learning to analyze massive data sets of animal communication and look for structure, patterns, grammar, things that might indicate meaning. They are not trying to translate dolphin calls into English sentences. They are trying to map the internal logic of dolphin communication on its own terms, and then find points of overlap with human communication. It is a fundamentally different approach than the sign language experiments of the 1970s, and early results are genuinely strange. The algorithms keep finding structure that researchers did not expect, complexity in the calls of humpback whales and crows and bats that does not have an obvious explanation in terms of simple signaling. There is a separate and deeply weird line of research involving dogs. A border collie named Chaser was taught the names of over 1,000 objects, more than any other non-human animal, and demonstrated that she understood names as a category. She could learn new names by exclusion, meaning if you showed her a pile of toys she knew and one she did not, and asked for the one she did not know by a new name, she would correctly retrieve the unknown object. She inferred that new names go with unknown things. That is a cognitive operation. It is not retrieval, it is reasoning. More recently, a startup has been selling recordable buttons that dogs can press to produce words, and a handful of dogs have been documented pressing sequences of buttons in ways that appear to be intentional communication, not just random pressing for attention. One dog reportedly pressed the buttons for outside, no, and buy in sequence when her owner was leaving. Skeptics point out that we are very good at finding meaning in patterns, even when the patterns are random. Researchers point out that something interesting keeps happening across multiple dogs in multiple households, and that is worth taking seriously. So, where does this leave us? We cannot have a conversation with a dolphin. We cannot ask an elephant how it feels about climate change. We cannot sit down with a border collie and discuss the news. The gap between human language and animal communication is real, and it is enormous. But it is not absolute. It is not a wall. It is more like a very wide, very complicated river. And on both sides, different species have built different kinds of boats. The animals that are closest to us in this sense, the great apes, the dolphins, the elephants, the ravens, the octopuses, who have their own alien form of problem solving that we barely understand, are demonstrating capabilities that keep revising our assumptions about what communication even is. Every time researchers have decided that some cognitive ability is uniquely human, some animal has come along and done a version of it. Theory of mind, tool use, culture, grief, planning for the future. Language is the last major holdout on that list, and it is looking increasingly like the holdout is not going to hold. The question was never really whether animals could talk. The question was always whether we were listening carefully enough to hear what they were already saying. The answer, based on 50 years of research and some of the most surprising experiments in the history of science, is that they have been saying a great deal, and we are only just beginning to understand it.